Bonjour et bienvenue à le 55, votre source pour le football universitaire canadien. Aujourd'hui, moi et Tom sommes de retour derrière les micros pour un nouvel épisode de notre série réunienne de la fin de saison. Cette fois, on met le cap de la saison. Le RSEQ pour parler de les Verts et Or de l'Université de Sherbrooke. On va discuter de l'été de l'équipe pour leur saison 2025 et de ce qui les attend pour la suite et bien plus encore. Mais avant tout ça, Tom, comment tu vas, mon ami?
Ça va très bien, mon frère. Mon ami, I think. And
Ses
that's
frères, toujours ses frères.
oh wow, what an incredible intro for all of our francophone listeners. Well done, my friend. I'm doing so well after that. I was a little nervous that you were going to ask me to do this whole thing in French.
Well, it was either a nice shout out to them or terribly offensive if I had gotten that wrong. But, we'll find out in the comments nonetheless.
For
If you
sure.
didn't catch all that, if you're an Anglophone or if you're a Francophone and you're like, what on earth was this guy saying? We're back for another installment of the Exit Meetings, and we are making our first trip to the RSEQ. We're talking a little Vert et Or football. Of course, that is the University de Sherbrooke. As always, we're going to go through all the details of the season previously, where they're kind of standing, and so much more. Now, Tom, obviously, RSEQ football, we've become very familiar with Montreal Laval because you can't consider yourself anything of a U Sport football and not understand the magnitude of what those programs have been doing for so long. McGill was a very, kind of I think a shared favorite of ours this year with obviously ELR and Jeremy Momo and our guy JT Copeland Lewis in the defensive secondary. And then Concordia and Sherbrooke are the teams that I feel like similarly with Acadia are kind of cap off this kind of group of teams that I'm excited in getting these opportunities to explore a little bit into, to uncover some of the details. And I feel like much like with the AUS, maybe more so with the RSEQ, especially now with Bishops coming back, and maybe we'll save that conversations for the Bishops pod. But you have this clear delineation, much like how St. Mary's and St. FX and Bishops had been sort of the cream of the crop for the AUS in these smaller conferences. And then with the RSEQ, same deal with Montreal, Laval. Again, McGill making a little bit of an interesting push to it. Whereas in contrast, our other small conference out in Can West, it's much more of a rotating door, and the OUA is just too big a conference to be able to break it down in such similar terms. What is sort of the thing you're most fascinated, excited about in having gone to prep for this episode about Sherbrooke and just getting to discuss in general about the state of the Vert et Or?
Well, it really just comes down to the entire state of the RSEQ for me. In doing your research and really looking into what Sherbrooke was doing well and their struggles and everything else, you start to realize most of the football fans that I speak to from across the country who are not as in tuned into the RSEQ are, okay, well, is it going to be Laval or Montreal going to come out of there and they're just steamrolling everybody else in that conference? Well, no, this is a very competitive conference. It's just the fact that the top two teams or two of the top teams in the entirety of U Sports are always in your conference. So that makes it very hard for anybody else to come out of this. But during a midway point through the year, at one point in time, it was 14-5 for Laval over Sherbrooke. Going into the fourth quarter, they showed some really outstanding games against a McGill squad that had just recently beaten Montreal. And so there was a lot of things to be excited about, certainly some aspects and some pieces that Sherbrooke is missing in order to make that big jump. But the gap between the top teams and I don't know, like the bottom or the rest is much closer than I thought it would be. A few key plays and this idea of, and I think you and I have talked about this before, you need to know how to win games. Can't take dumb penalties, have to be able to close games out, have to give 60 minutes worth of effort, whatever. But like a few small changes here and there from Sherbrooke missing the playoffs to like making a legit push.
And, we'll go through the games in slightly more detail momentarily. And obviously, when you mention like a few small things here and there, there's a kind of major small moment at the end of their second matchup with Concordia, I believe it was. I think it was the night before we were doing the Western Laurier. So right towards the end of the regular season in all conferences, where Concordia strikes on a bomb at the end of the game to take that one. And that's the difference between Sherbrooke ending up at the bottom of the RCQ, losing the tiebreak with McGill for points or what have you, and Concordia being that 3 seed making the playoffs, and vice versa with Sherbrooke with the potential of being in that spot. And you talk about the all that piece that we always discuss of learning how to win. And I think that's a nice segue to, much like with some of these teams that we're becoming more familiar with. And as a result, I think many of the people that tune in still with us, still having a predominantly Ontario based fan base, are becoming more familiar with, is to start with the headman, the entraîneur en chef, if you will, who is, of course, Mr. Kevin Regimbal Gagné, who is Sherbrooke Vert or through and through, was a player from '08 to 2012, was a member of the staff since 2016, served as special teams coordinator up until he took over as the headman in 2023. I think I got that right. 26, 17 special teams coordinator, 23 becomes the head coach. And so that's, I guess, what, third year as the head coach, relatively young man, by the way, rocks that Under Armour Sherbrooke button up so nicely. Sherbrooke, large and XL, whichever one's going to work. If you want me looking like all muscular like Coach Regimbal Gagné, let's go with the large. If you want me feeling a bit more comfortable, send me the XL. Tom will take the two or the three. I'll let you decide that one, but that's a nice look. I like that logo. That's a nice green. Anyways, young coach, Sherbrooke through and through, stint in the CFL. So he brings a lot of that expertise, brings a lot of that culture. Similarly, when we talked about with Acadia and just with Coach Coulson coming back to be that offensive coordinator, that sort of legacy. Obviously, when we talk about Coach Brady going back to Maune, these things are important. These things are meaningful. People understand this. So again, without knowing too much about him elsewise in his playing days, his stint in the CFL, his time as a special teams coordinator, I'm always gonna like that aspect of a coach who knows the culture. And I mean, it's also worth saying at this point that sometimes cultures need to change. So that's not always the case, but generally speaking, without knowing anything more, I am pro a situation like they have with Coach Regimbal Gagné.
Yeah, certainly. Whenever you have a former player who can come back and help out. Now, obviously, just because you played there doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a great coach and all of those things. But a lot of times when you have that, you have somebody who understands the tradition of the school, understands what it means in order to be into that spotlight. And let's not forget, in that 2012 season, if I'm getting my memories right, I believe that's when Sherbrooke has one of the best offenses, period, with Jordan. I can't remember the quarterback's name, but I remember Sherbrooke being like, everybody's turning their heads and being like, oh, there's another team outside of Laval and Montreal out in the RSEQ. This is crazy. So even showing being on that team when you are doing well, you are successful, it means that you understand that what it takes in order to get to that point. And having that in the back of his pocket to go forward here, I think is a great aspect of this. And once again, yeah, you finished 2-6 on the season, but if not for a couple of bounces or the one big touchdown, like you mentioned, they're in the playoffs and they're fighting for a spot.
And as we talked about, they take a game off McGill. They lose one. They lose two, technically, one being an exhibition game, if memory serves, or maybe that one was a regular season event. But, again, it's a team that goes 2-6, and kind of similar to what we talked about with Acadia. It's like you got to understand what the wins sort of in the totality of the season are for you. In the same way that Acadia's got to go into a year like last year and say, take care of business against Maune. Maybe you give a scare to a team above you, so on and so forth. And you call that a successful season with where you're at this stage. And, again, we're learning about Sherbrooke right now. And to the fans out there listening, again, thank you for tuning in, wherever you're tuning in, however you're tuning in. Always appreciate it. But it speaks to the, as you mentioned, the both like the depth of the conference, but while still having this sort of two kind of tiers to it, kind of like how F1 racing, there's always hey, you're in that 7 through 12 bracket. Your job is to be competitive with the folks in there. And so they lose a game to McGill 38-22. They lose to Montreal 44-7. They lose to Laval 28-5, a game that you'd mentioned, again, slow start, which wasn't uncommon to see from Laval this year, but obviously push came to shove and they were able to pick up those major wins until, of course, that Dussault Cup. Then they go on the 2-game streak, take out Concordia. They take out McGill, a game in which, I mean, we're going to start talking about players. I am so infatuated with this young man, Benjamin Perron, that they got there at. I don't know if it's field or boundary half. I was watching some of his CJEP tape, and I was saying to Tom a moment ago before we started, like, kind of gives me Anthony Moore Tuzo vibes. Shout out to the Royal City there. Shout out to the Hammer. Tuzo being a product of Cardinal. It doesn't matter. Cardinal Newman. All point aside, this guy Perron, absolute weapon for them, all Canadian as the obviously year broke down. But and then they finish off with the loss at Montreal, that tough, heartbreaking loss at Concordia that we talked about, and then a bad one to Laval. So again, you lose that heartbreaker to Concordia. The game against Montreal, McGill to start off the season, pretty high scoring affair. But overall, you take care of business, you get the heartbreaker. I would say that for a team that is, young both in the coaching staff and somewhat, as you commented, small in the coaching staff, just in sheer numbers, not in musculature. Because the guy, again, these Under Armour Sherbrooke shirts are looking nice, man. Muscles are popping everywhere. But again, it has that feeling of a team that's building, new-ish coach, young guy getting his feet wet in the U Sport scene as a coach. And I feel like on the whole, it's a year that. I don't know. At the end of the day, if I'll try and pull up what the Concordia loss to Laval was in the first round, but I mean, how much better is that for you? Yes, your young guys get the experience and all that type of stuff, but if you just get your hat handed to you, maybe at the end of the day, it's not the best thing, but who knows?
Certainly, and at some point in time, yes, when you look at across the board, I would say that it's fair to say Montreal and Laval have higher rated, better quality players in certain positions than Sherbrooke does. But there's also just a matchup issue, just in terms of the makeups of teams. Obviously Sherbrooke really struggled in the air. Jeremy Fife had a little bit. They experimented with a couple of guys, but didn't really wow anybody, even in some of his best games. But it was really the two backs between Martel Joseph and between Caesar, who between the two of them were often rushing for over 150, 200 yards in a single game, which is great when you're playing against Concordia or McGill or everything else. Montreal and Laval, especially in most years, but especially this year, the front seven of those teams were dominant monsters. And so when your strength is running the ball and your strength of the defense is the front seven, you see how that can get really it can be very tough. And then when you're into those situations against any good team, but especially a Montreal and Laval, if you create an offense to be one dimensional so that you have to throw the ball, you have to run the ball, you're done. If you can't surprise them, if they can just pin their ears back and come after you, it's incredibly difficult. But once again, it's a shout out to the Sherbrooke defense that against the Laval squad that, like you mentioned, had some issues this year with slow starts, we're still keeping them in one touchdown in that first game, and suddenly Sherbrooke's right into it, and you're a real serious threat and everything else. So things to work out on the offensive side, certainly. Would love to see Jeremy Fife get a little bit more comfortable and a little bit better in that pocket and throwing around. But at the end of the day, those top tier teams, it was just a bad matchup for Sherbrooke this year.
And I like that you brought the running backs, Martel Joseph and Caesar, and though I couldn't confirm because, with all things U Sport football, it's sometimes tough to find things that should be pretty obvious. I'm assuming it's the same Freud Caesar, though the one listed here has kind of a middle name action going on, but that was running the ball for Carleton a couple years ago. I just can't imagine that's that common a name. Maybe it is. Two Freud Caesars who were running backs in U Sports within the last 5 years or so. One in the Ottawa region and one in Sherbrooke. Crazier things have happened, I suppose. You bring up Fife, though, and I think you were dead on just the assessment of it, of our trying to understand from afar and whatnot. I think the question, though, is, and brought up Carleton, as far as teams whose websites we don't love, Sherbrooke, love the fits, still want that Under Armour shirt. We got to work on this website a little bit. And it's not the French piece of it. It's, it's a little difficult to discern about, you're making us do a more work than we really need to be able to cover it. So I say all that in that, we had a little more confidence of the direction that Acadia looked like they were going in terms of their quarterback, even though there was a little bit of the quarterback roulette, which we are firmly of the belief that like that's sometimes that's out of necessity. You got to do that depending on the state of your team. But if you have a choice in the matter, I mean, I guess you always have a choice, but ideally, who your quarterback is. Looking at the numbers, because also, Samuel Goulet Menard, not with nearly a number of attempts that Fife had on the season, but just when you go through it, it's like, it doesn't scream to me of, that this guy's clearly still QB1. I'm sure they're still, going to work it out in camp and in their off season and all the stuff they're doing right now. So I'm curious because it also didn't really look like there was, I forget the gentleman's name with Acadia, just harkening back to that being our most recent episode where you could see, okay, the QB and this receiver seemed to have like at the offense's most productive time. It seemed like this QB and receiver were really hitting it off. When this offense was at its highest, you already mentioned it. It's because Martel Joseph's picking up, was it 186 in that win against McGill? Freud Caesar's adding in some good numbers as well. And again, it's that much more impressive in a conference where front sevens typically are the thing that not only win you championships, conference championships, but can lead you to Vanier Cup championships. So frankly, that's super impressive. So curious to see what direction they go in that regard, because it seems like it would be an open competition from afar, if you will.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we got some clarification on the last Acadia pod. Connor McName, who's looked to be the QB1 going into the season, tore his ACL for Acadia, which is why you saw so many guys who were in there going back and forth. Shout out to Coach Tyler, who reached out and corrected us there. We appreciate you, man. But going into this one, I mean, yes, there could have been some injuries. There could have been whatever else. But like with the numbers that are here, Fife, 89 for 167. That's a 53% completion rating. 133 yards per game, 3 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. Like, I don't think that anybody would be happy with that, including Fife. And I think that you're looking for something else, whether that's a different guy in there, whether you're calling different plays or whatever the case may be. But nobody's looking at that stat line being like, I'm going to sign off on this. I'm writing home saying, yeah, everything's peachy. But again, I think a big piece of that is if you get one dimensional here, that's where a lot of that happens. I mean, again, you don't want to compare it because these are different teams and whatever else. But like you saw that with Windsor a little bit here, where you see a quarterback that's trying to come out and trying to do their thing, but is really relying on that outstanding run game. If that run game gets shut down and becomes a whole lot harder, it's the same thing out here. So I think that Sherbrooke certainly got a lot of things to look at on the offensive side. Now, it is nice to see Fife is a third-year guy. Martel Joseph's a third-year guy. Freud Caesar is a fourth year, but he could come back again. So you've got some key pieces that are there. But then you look over on the defensive side, and I'm sure you're looking to transition here as well. But Perron, like you were mentioning, your RSEQ All-Star, first-team All-Canadian, is only in his second year of eligibility. That's got to be incredibly promising for any Verteor fans out there, knowing that you've got a stud on the defense for at least another couple years.
100%. And I'm assuming that one Maxime Perron, who's listed as defensive back, who's their second leader in tackles, perhaps brother of Benjamin Perron, also listed as what was he in his listed in his third year. So again, you get a lot of flexibility there, and then you add in a young guy as well in Charles Antoine Ledoux, who by the website for Sherbrooke listed as secondaire, on the U Sports website listed as linebacker. I spin those in my head. I come up with Sam linebacker. Who knows? Somewhere in the mix. And what I love the most is you got again guys who are listed as sort of secondary players, these hybrid linebacker types, which, is everyone's dream that you can go half to half and they're all essentially the same athlete with a little variation. And they're all like 6'1", 6'2", and above. So like, again, they're coaching them up well. They're training them up well there. Doing all the things that just make our Quebec athletes just seemingly so dominant out of the area. And again, no doubt some other terrific players on that defense, though. Again, we're now starting to uncover a little bit more about this team, and I think there is promise for it. And again, we're a ways away from talking about the teams towards the top, but I mean Montreal again, just to with coming off of the Vanier, with Pepe Gonzalez as the rookie quarterback, and with that defense being so strong, losing a few key pieces. I mean, they don't look like they're going anywhere. Laval, obviously, there's going to be some turnover there. That'll be interesting to see what they do with Desjardins. But overall, they're going to be strong. McGill has some good pieces, but it's just, and we'll do our dive into Concordia in a few weeks. And Bishop's coming back in the RSEQ. It's honestly like the RSEQ is, I mean, beyond the fact that TVA is the best product in terms of their production of these games, like I gotta find a way to get that subscription, get that on cable, whatever it is, because it's not just, oh, Montreal and Laval aren't playing, I don't really care. This is week in, week out. There are going to be fascinating things to watch in the queue this year, even if it's Montreal Sherbrooke, even if it's Laval Concordia, all the way through. Bishop's in the mix now. I think this is truly like to like hopefully demonstrate how I've tried to be unbiased in my appreciation for calling like the OUA the better conference. I think firmly now that Quebec has that title over the OUA going into this year with how it's matching up with these teams. I'd always concede that like if they didn't have the top two in the country, they were two of the top five, and we all know that. And then you add in, of course, your Westerns and Lauriers, and on any given day, it could be a Queens jumping up there. Obviously, teams from Can West having an argument, but this like saying the depth of the OUA, we have so many just, if not excellent, so many good teams. I just think even though it's a smaller conference with Bishops going back in there and what we're seeing from this club, and we'll do the dive in Concordia. We love what the Redbirds are doing. I think the Q is right now the best conference of football. And I know a lot of people are listening to that and saying, well, yeah, we've had how many Vanier Cup champions in this decade so far? I get it. It was that depth piece that always had me coming back to the OUA. And we'll be doing some OUA pods in the next weeks to come. We're getting back into our, bread and butter, and maybe I'll get swayed back there by just the romance of talking about, the conference that we played in. But I think right now the Q's got the crown right now, and beyond just the Vanier Cup itself.
Certainly, when you look at the success that Bishops has had out in the AUS, they're going to come back in with a solid team and going to be competing right away. The bottom tier of that RSEQ is in a lot of these games, and they're competitive throughout. And again, like you mentioned, the last 4 Vanier Cups have been either Laval or Montreal. So how do you not look at this conference saying that it's the best in terms of that win percentage? Now, obviously, if you're looking at top to bottom, anything can happen to just the excitement of each game. I'd probably look over to the Can West for something like that, where anybody can win on any given Saturday. But all that coupled with just the winning percentage of this of this conference, even if it is dominated by just 2 teams, is truly incredible here. And right now, for the better part of this decade, the Vanier Cup runs through Quebec, runs through the RSEQ. So, yeah, I would have to agree with your statement.
We shall doff our metaphorical caps to the RSEQ. And of course, this coming year, it will literally run through the RSEQ, with Stade Talus being the home for the Vanier Cup this year. Tom, I'd say for a couple, Joe Blows that aren't, too tuned into Sherbrooke football, I'd say that was a pretty good job. Final thoughts from you, that is, on Les Verts et Or.
Well, in doing some more research into this and talking to some folks in the RSEQ, come to find that the stadium for Sherbrooke, the stadium itself looks really nice. It's in a big, beautiful field and everything else, up until you look at the field itself, where the field from the 0 to the 0 is grass, but the end zones are turf. And so trying to plan for that, trying to get the right kind of footing for that, because you could be solid from one end to the other end and then start slipping in the end zone or anything like that, is very interesting. You could tell that this stadium was built for something else in mind, because it's beautifully maintained, at least from the photos that I've seen of it. But the turf end zones mean that most of the time, especially with the Montreal games that I've been seeing here, the game plan is obviously to win, but to win and put up as many points as you can so that you can justify putting backups in, because there's tendencies to have some injuries when you've got different field types, I guess, that's out there. So I thought that was just really interesting, that I just wanted to comment saying, that's kind of cool. Or maybe not, depending on if you have to play on that. But still, the stadium itself looks very, very nice. The atmosphere of the venue, just thought that was an interesting point to point out.
Well, if I'm known for nothing else, it's certainly being known for loving fun facts about the University of Sherbrooke. We certainly know this. Tom, outstanding job by you. We'll be back next week, back in the OU way. We might play around with who, based on our metrics, would be the next one up, because it pairs up with some other news that I think the timing's right to discuss. So we'll figure that out. And either way, we'll be talking to you about some U Sport football next week right here at the 55.